The crowd gathered, the bards stopped playing, all were silent, and the story of the swords, as told by Mick Thriker, began. Almost a decade ago, as you know, times were different. War hadn't yet begun to seep into the country, and for some reason it seemed the weather was better. That could have been my imagination, though. Dave and I spent half our time tending to fields for extra money, and the other half chasing through the countryside, trying to satisfy our young hearts' ambitions to make something of ourselves. One day in particular, a few weeks before crop planting, while the frost was still on the ground, Dave and I decided to take a trip to a geological anomaly 20 miles north of our hometown of Shalator called the Tharbjorn Escarpment. We both enjoy the science of geology and try to get out as much as possible, attempting to experience firsthand the ancient forces of nature at work. We departed Shalator with all our traveling gear and enough food to last a week and a half. Since this is a story about obtaining our current swords, we carried our old swords with on the trip, and no, Jason, not our childhood wooden swords. At the time, we wielded inexpensive specimens we had bought from a traveling merchant. The first day, we covered 8 miles and made camp on a picturesque knoll surrounded by morass, if I remember correctly. The next morning, before we started off again, Dave crawled out of his tent and said, "If we can cover the same amount of ground today as we did yesterday, we should arrive by midday the day after today." "You mean tomorrow?" "Yes, the day after today." Dave exuded a quizzical face. "Tomorrow," I repeated. Dave continued to be puzzled. I couldn't help but carry on the charade. I began to laugh. Dave finally realized I was being a pest and replied, trying to hold in a smile, "Oh, just finish packing your gear and let's go." So we started on the day's walk and kicked off many miles by nightfall. We camped again, and by that time we were really starting to enjoy the trip. I recall that night, while staring endlessly at the stars, Dave talking about a girl he used to like, a real brown-haired stunner, according to him. The next day we arrived at Tharbjorn Escarpment and constructed our campsite right away. We were planning on staying for 5 days and nights. The Tharbjorn itself was an ancient place, encompassing approximately 10 square miles. The whole locale was a densely forested, dark landscape containing boulders from a prehistoric formation. A movable masses scattered onto almost every spot a boulder could be put. In many places, the actual formation itself reared its awesome facade high above the ground, and especially in some places it seemed to almost kiss the sky. The main escarpment was a huge 150-foot high cliff face running down the middle of the entire area like a spine. There was also a river that tore through the locale and rare fascinating plant species strewn about, which were indigenous to that setting alone. None of the rare plants, however, had any real value, none known of anyways by anyone at the time. There were also remnants of old ruins left over from some primitive civilization that had settled in the area many thousands of years ago. Very interesting stuff. But the main fascination with the Tharbjorn wasn't the boulders everywhere, stacked on top of each other almost infinitely. It wasn't the darkest forest you could possibly imagine, or the huge drop-off seen from the top of the cliff. Nor was it the massive rock formations or rare native plant species. It wasn't the interesting stone ruins of a town built long ago by ancient inhabitants. The real fascination was the fact that millions of years ago an ancient river flowed through the Tharbjorn, 15 times bigger than the current river in the opposite direction than it does today. And because that river was so big and powerful, a person could walk around and find the smoothing of rocks caused by the rushing water. The formation was an extremely hard igneous rock, so the only force strong enough to smooth it out was the torrent from a tremendous amount of water. Where the prehistoric river flowed over the escarpment itself, a person could really see the vestiges of the river and its powerful force. The exact location of the smoothing on the escarpment is how one knows the river flowed in the opposite direction long ago. That's where Dave and I spent most of our time, both on top and bottom of the cliff, imagining the powerful forces that once engaged the vicinity. Our campsite was also near that area. First thing we did, though, before we were able to do any exploring, was to go to the existing river and procure our supply of fish for the 5 days plan. That took us longer than what we wanted, so as soon as we got back to our campsite that night, we collapsed and relaxed. Why do you think we had such a hard time catching fish today, Mick? I couldn't tell you, but it might have something to do with the abundance of beavers and muskrats down by the river. Speaking of furry creatures, look over there, a coyote. It's pacing in circles for some reason, I said. That's funny. I think I'm going to bed. Maybe it'll still be doing it in the morning. Perhaps. We didn't wake to further coyotes strangely walking circles since we were disappointed we never got the chance the day before. The first thing we did that morning after breakfast was to head to the cliff, bringing with our most studious selves. Having pursued awe-inspiring features at the cliff for an hour, I voiced, "Come over here, Dave, look at this fantastic specimen." Dave walked over by me and inspected the smooth surface. He pondered for a while, looked up, and said while pointing to where he was looking, "I'm almost certain this was caused by rushing water compressed by those two giant pillars of stone up there. I wonder if they're smoothing on the inside of those stone pillars too." "Yeah, we'll have to look next time we're up on top of the cliff," Dave replied. We continued inspecting the rocks for a while, then I came to a conclusion of sorts, and shared it with Dave. After studying this site for a while, I think I can safely say that the only river in the entire country that would have had enough size to accomplish so much weathering is the Jeanhavagel River. At some point in its life cycle, I believe a much larger Jeanhavagel flowed through this point, producing the smoothing we're currently finding. The same river that flows past the capital? But that's many miles away from here. However, a few moments after Dave said that, he realized how my theory was plausible. As I did, he put into play the magnificent power of the glaciers that once engulfed the area and how easily they could change the course of a river. You're probably right, Nick, now that I think about it. This sure is quite the tremendous place of mystery.